Episode 21, Beer. It's Pilgrim breakfast. We are not drunk yet. Hello, and welcome to the history of American food. This week, I'll be looking at 17th century British colonial beer culture with just a splash of German thrown in, and what made the colonial beer of this century different from any other American beer. We'll also look at how nearly universal beer consumption did not lead to general drunkenness. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The most important thing to know about 17th century beer culture in the North American colonies is that except for a few historical society revivals and the like, there is absolutely no resemblance whatsoever between early colonial beer and modern American beer. Between knowledge transfers from West African brewers, the immigration of large numbers of families from the Low Countries, the German states, Bavaria, and Bohemia, leaps forward in access to milling technology, access to relatively cheap molasses and sugar, and acceptance of different grains as malts, entirely new brewing traditions grew up rapidly in the 18th century, and just about everything that set the 17th century apart was left behind. The growth of trade with England between the 17th versus the 18th century was startling, and one place that left a mark was the almost complete turnover in beer brewing, the ingredients, the techniques, and the locations. In the 17th century, I'll be focusing closely on the late 16th and early 17th century English beer and ale brewing styles that were imported to and then heavily adapted in America. The resulting styles and practices will all but disappear as American beer is altered in the 18th and then the 19th and the 20th centuries. Mills, war, prohibition, and refrigerators changed things so much, so many times, we have to regard the separate chunks of American beer history as just that, entirely separate. For those of you familiar with the world of beer brewing, some of what went on is going to sound weird. For those of you not familiar with the world of beer brewing, I promise not to get into the minutiae of the practice. Instead, I'm going to mainly stick to the information that was important to the 17th century brewer. If you're wishing for more science, there are approximately a gazillion beer podcasts out there, about 500,000 books, and probably a local brew shop near you, happy to talk beer science with you. So I'll be very history-focused for this episode and limit my modern science stuff. Oh, and yes, what I am calling beer went by many names, but they were used almost indiscriminately and interchangeably in written documents. So for simplicity's sake, I am sticking to the most general American English name, beer. To get started, I will cover the basics of beer making for a 17th century English-style brewer, why beer was such a big deal in the 17th century colonies, and just what hurdles a 17th century brewer faced as she attempted to bring civilized English beer to the wilderness of the New World. And then peek around the corner at what was happening as the wheat and barley growers got going in Pennsylvania, bringing their German, Bavarian, and Bohemian traditions with them. In the 17th century, all the home brewers and many of the head brewers at small commercial establishments like inns and taverns were women. If it was a beer business, the money side was usually handled by a father, husband, uncle, or brother. But in the 17th century, brewing was still largely considered a cooking task, and as such was firmly the province of women, especially when it was done as a home chore or in small groups where little or no money was exchanged. In large cities, there were some large-scale brewing operations run and overseen by men, and they seem much more prevalent because that is where most writing and publishing was done. But on average, most of the beer drunk by most of the people was brewed by women. So a quick and oversimplified review of what it took to make 17th century beer. To the 17th century beer drinker, beer was a grain-based beverage. The grain was made sweet in one of three ways: brewed to transfer the sweet stuff into water, and then that sweet water was fermented into alcoholic beers of different strengths. The fermenting was done by mostly yeast, but in the world before Pasteur and germ theory, when no one was creating strains of pure yeast, there were also a reasonable number of other, usually benign microfauna along for the ride. The 17th century brewer didn't know about yeast as an organism, but she did know there were things she could add and do to encourage better fermentation. And those things generally encouraged the yeast and kept out most of the not yeast. European beer flavoring had largely settled into a new pattern by the 17th century as well. In England, before the 16th century, all beer was flavored with a wide variety of herbal mixtures, generally known as groots. These flavored the beer, hopefully helped to preserve it, and some of the concoctions also carried hallucinogenic, euphoric, or soporific characteristics. Initially, groots were despised by the Catholic Church and seen as tools of pagan worship. To discredit non-Christian brewers and female brewsters, a tie was made between beer brewing and witchcraft. Much money and effort was spent trying to stamp out the barbaric practice of beer brewing. But by the High Middle Ages, the Church had realized having their monks make up groots and sell them was a much better solution to the problem. They could simply make money through appropriation rather than spend money on prohibition. There was a lot of money to be made selling people what they wanted to do anyway. As different countries went Protestant, taking up hops instead of groots was included in the Reformation's boycotting of all things popish. The destruction of the abbeys in England by Henry VIII and the continued rise of different Protestant factions under Queen Elizabeth I and the mess that was the English Civil War all pushed groot beers further out and hopped beers in. Hops noticeably extended the shelf life of beer, which was very welcome as beer, along with biscuit, salt beef, and hard cheese, were loaded onto ships as both war and commerce took to the sea. Beer was very much preferred over water by ordinary sailors, as wooden casks of water tended to grow green stuff and tiny critters. The combination of alcohol and hops in the beer casks kept such intrusions at bay. The beer might have been musty and sour, but at least it didn't make people ill, as the long-casked water was wont to do. The water, like many other naval supplies, was often taken from dubious sources on land. In the 17th century, just about everything under the beer umbrella was grain-based, and the grains used around the world were many and varied. Barley, wheat, rye, and oats in Europe, wheat, barley, sorghum, millet, and corn in Africa, millet, barley, and rice in Asia, and corn in the Americas. But not all grain-based beverages qualify as beer. Some cultures also had traditions of roasting and brewing grains as teas. You can check out modern versions in things like the tasty and refreshing Korean barley tea, Bori cha, and Japanese roasted rice green tea, Genmai cha. These were and are made with grains that were both unsprouted and unfermented. So the starches are intact, and the main flavor you get are more like toast. They are brewed, but they are not beer. Then there are varieties of unfermented malt beverages, sort of liquid breads, where the starches are broken down to be sweet, and then they are also brewed like tea. In the 17th century, these were regularly found in countries with Muslim populations that were rejecting alcohol. If you're curious and want to peek into this range of flavors, different versions currently exist globally. Two pretty easy-to-find versions in the U.S. are the Goya brand's Malta and non-alcoholic versions of Russian Kvass. Monasteryski is a brand that I've tried. But if grain is going to become beer, it must be taken through a number of specific steps in a specific order. This multi-step manipulation, incidentally, was part of what caused the Greeks and Romans to see beer as inferior to wine when dealing with both the Egyptians and the wild peoples north of the Mediterranean. Wine apparently made itself and was numbered among the gifts from the gods. beer required human intervention, the sprouting, drying, brewing, before the gods could come in and take on the mystery of fermentation. And thus, beer was inferior. So how did a 17th century brewer see all those steps? First, grains had to be made sweet. In the 17th century, there were 3 methods in vogue around the globe. Grain was either salivated and expectorated, also known as chewed and spit out, or it was inoculated with carefully cultivated molds, or it was tricked into sprouting like it was going to grow. This last method, the sprouting trick, was the method the English colonists brought with them, and they called it malting. To malt grain, it was moistened and sprouted until judged sweet enough. Then it was toasted to stop the sprout. Since this toasting was done in a pan or cauldron over a fire, the toasting was often uneven and usually left the sprouted toasted grain, the malt, with some level of a smoky or bitter flavor, along with the pleasant toasty ones. The malt toasting stage required skillful fire building and lots of attention. The goal was an even roast, so every grain was toasted, but not burned. Even today, the malt roasting stage is one of the places much about a beer's character is decided. But all 17th century English beer was some flavor of dark beer and or smoked beer. After being toasted, the malt was cracked or coarsely ground, a tiring procedure done in a mortar and pestle or on a quern. The cracked malt would then be boiled for several hours to extract the sweetness into water. This is the step in beer that is the brewing. Getting the brew correctly sweet and correctly flavored was considered the most important step. It was the one place where a brewer had the most control, and the place she could place her individual stamp on the beverage. It was also the one where women making beer were most likely to look like the witch image of the popular imagination while they were performing it. The brew was boiled for hours to reach the right level of sweetness and flavor. It was stirred to prevent scorching, and fruit, tree branches, or roots were all added according to recipes held in her head, often never fully shared or written down, and largely because they changed all the time due to the season and what ingredients were available. But once the brew was right, it was poured off or strained from the larger solids and cooled down. Maybe a few more herbs were added to get just the right flavor and possibly a medicinal kick. All of this meant, by the 17th century, everyone in the beer game knew that you needed a liquid of a certain minimum sweetness to make beer. This liquid, the technical name is wort, had to be sweet enough or the beer wouldn't activate, and different sweetnesses made beer with a greater or lesser alcohol kick. A sweeter wort made a beer that would keep longer and be stronger. A less sweet wort made for a weaker, possibly sour, short-keeping, daily beer. When grain was in short supply, as was usually the case for the 17th century colonists, the wort was fortified up to the correct sweetness with honey or fruits. In those early colonial years, few people had the extra time or energy to go hunt for enough honey, so fruit-spiked beer was the name of the game. In the 18th century and later, when sugar is more available and milling technology picked up, and more beer traditions from both Europe and West Africa were in the mix, everything would change. And when germ theory was better understood and fermentation was mechanized, it would all change once again. But for now, we're in the 17th century North American colonies, where there was effectively no refined sugar, no molasses, so when grain was short, fruit stepped in. Now here's where I had to veer off the road for a second. What's the difference between these colonial fruit beers and, say, cider or even wine? All wines and wine relatives, like cider and perry, are made from just the juice of a fruit. Grapes, apples, pears, and so on. They are fruit juice that was allowed to work in a vessel until it quit bubbling. That is, the yeast doing the work, A, ran out of food, or B, died of alcohol poisoning. The fermented result was allowed to rest, let the sediment settle, and then aged for a while until it got tasty. From the 17th century point of view, and before, wines simply happened. The winemaker had to be careful to produce the correct conditions to separate wine from simply fruit juice rotting. But because yeast and a few friends simply hang out on the skins of ripe fruit, wine just happens given the right conditions. And I'll go more into this in the upcoming cider episode. So colonial fruit beer was not like wine because the fruit was boiled in water. It was brewed to make wort, the sweet liquid that would be fermented. Overall, the big difference was wine happened, but beer was brewed. And once the brew is complete, the wort, or baby unfermented beer, reached the right sweetness, it had to be cooled. If the wort after the brewing was too hot, the added fermentation agent wouldn't work. That meant the brewer had to cool the boiled wort enough, but not too much, before the fermentation was started. By the 17th century, European brewers had generally identified yeast as the agent they needed to add to get the beer working, even if they didn't exactly know what it was. So brewers would either use the sludge from fermentations of previous batches, often called emptins, or they would use barm, the foamy liquid suspension of yeast from the top of an actively working brew, and typically what bakers would also use, or they would add some beer from an active beer batch to new wort to get things going. In Europe, dedicated brew houses in taverns and abbeys might have enough yeast in the air or falling from the rafters to spontaneously start brewing. But for the colonial woman brewing in the cauldron around her fire, no such chances were taken. Yeast from the beer and bread supply would go in to ensure the transformation of the wort to beer. Depending on the temperature and the sweetness of the wort, the ferment might be vigorous and complete quickly over a few days, or burble along lazily for a few weeks. But once the yeast stopped its bubbling, the beer was ready for one of two fates. If it was small or low alcohol beer for daily use, it would be drunk over the next few days or weeks. If it was stronger beer, it was usually stored for long keeping or sold as a quality cask conditioned product. I cannot emphasize enough that nearly all beer brewing was done by women and servants or slaves in the home. Until thermometers, metal tanks, and large capital investments became part of the brewing game, beer making was women's work. Yes, in the 17th century, there were inns, taverns, and public houses that served beer to the public, and had been in Europe since at least the 10th or 11th centuries. But even there, while the establishment might be owned by a husband, father, or other male relative, since financial transactions involving property usually required a male sanction. But the actual brewing was cooking work, thus women's work. All the steps above were done by women brewsters trained by generations of their brewing foremothers. In larger cities that had large commercial breweries, there were professional male maltsters and brewsters. But at this point, they were the exception. Pointing to the continuing primacy of female brewers is the fact that professional brewers' guilds, which allowed male members only, were typically formed at least a century after other craft guilds. The shift in the balance of changing brewing from women's work to men's work beyond larger cities happened in the 18th century. That's when brewing consolidated, became a money-making business, and largely moved out of the home. One telltale of this is the disappearance of beer brewing recipes from cookbooks and recipe collections. So why was beer such a big deal in the 17th century? William Bradford writes about the lack of beer as a contributing factor for the voyage of the Mayflower ending in Massachusetts before Virginia could be found. The Jamestown colony, once it got over gold fever, wrote home for someone to please come over and brew some beer. 16th century explorers, when commenting on the weird New World grain, corn, made sure to test it as a base for beer. All of this had to do with a handful of factors. The first being that to be connected to the economic life in England, large numbers of English people lived in somewhat crowded villages or around commerce centers like London, Liverpool, Plymouth, or Sheffield, where the rivers and streams were polluted by their use as sewers, industrial waste disposal, and overuse by livestock. Also, while plenty of English people did drink water from wells and springs, it was seen as a drink of last resort, or for the hopelessly rustic, or the destitute, or for sinners and for religious nuts of a particular stripe. Beer was a drink that promoted health, refreshment, sociability, and signaled participation in the civilized world. In terms of the historical record, it was both more fun and more profitable to write things like, "Only weirdos drink water," and "Drink my beer, it will make you strong and awesome," as compared to writing things like, "Water is largely fine. If boring, don't drink the Thames." For as much as we gasp and make shocked faces at this attitude, and at the idea of giving beer to small children or pregnant women, we need to get some clear ideas of just what 17th century beer was like and what it did. First, yes, it did have alcohol, but small beer, the stuff drunk by children and at breakfast, rarely had alcohol by volume or an ABV above 3%, and it was usually lower, sometimes hovering around 1%, or the ABV of modern kombucha. This meant there was enough alcohol to keep a variety of dangerous microfauna from moving in, but the alcohol level was also low enough that it was metabolized at approximately the same rate it was absorbed into the body, so it couldn't make anyone drunk. But what beer had that really mattered were calories, protein, and vitamins. The roughly filtered 17th century brews carried not only alcohol calories, but also unmalted starch calories, fats, and proteins from the grain, bran, and germ, along with proteins and important B vitamins from all the little yeast corpses that had given their all. In a society where the poorest classes had extremely limited access to meat, and no dairy foods for portions of the year, and a glass of milk was not an option for most children, a reasonably shelf-stable, high-calorie drink that contributed protein, B vitamins, and some salts and minerals filled an important gap. In a monotonous diet that leaned heavily on grains, peas, and pickled vegetables, the contributions of beer were important. For many people, it was seen as an absolutely essential portion of a healthy diet. And for those segments of society that lacked regular access to meat and dairy, and also made limited use of vegetable protein sources, they were absolutely right. Oh, and one last thing about 17th century beer, it was flat. Young beer might have a mild effervescent tingle, but beer in this age was not stored in a pressure vessel of any sort, so the carbon dioxide that gives beer its modern fizz simply escaped. So it was with these labels of essential and civilized that beer was brought to the New World. Beer had to be had, but right from the get-go, there were problems. First, barley, the cornerstone of good beer, nowhere near enough of it was grown in the New World. The main reasons were it was too cold in New England and people were bad grain farmers in Virginia. Second, hops, which by the 17th century were considered absolutely essential for real beer, were thin on the ground. And most of all, especially in Jamestown, where there were almost no women, the colonists were discovering that brewing with 17th century basic tools was a highly skilled job that required a head full of carefully cultivated knowledge and lots of practice. But after some struggle, trial and error, the brewers got to work, even without the grain and hops they wanted. They experimented with corn. Some grain was used, though most of it went into making pones, breads, puddings, and mushes. But the cobs and stalks, especially before there were many cows, they still contained sweet corn juices, so they were sometimes added to the brews. Other attempts to sweeten worts meant using fruits like persimmons, beach plums, and as mentioned before, pumpkins. All these fruits, and later some roots like parsnips and sweet potatoes, were also added to bring up the sweetness of a brewed wort. There are hops varieties native to North America, and they were available in the areas where early brewing was happening. But they were growing wild and had to be foraged, not cooperatively growing in fields where they could be gathered all at once. And picking hops is a bit of a pain. They are covered in the grabby, spiny filaments they use to climb. So until hop fields were set up and harvested by dedicated pickers, it was not unusual to import English hops, or simply do without and substitute local plants that had less formidable defenses. In the absence of hops, some of the old Groot herbs were brought back: chamomile, yarrow, tansy, and even North American sassafras. Inspired by the Native American practice of chewing on the tender spring needles of spruce trees to get at the vitamin C, branches of spruce and later other evergreens like pine and cedar were used as bittering agents and as a hoped-for tonic. Over time, spruce did become the favorite, even though it was usually boiled for so long in the wort it destroyed the vitamin C. Brewing, fermenting, storage space, and cleanliness of the brewing equipment were also problems. Because of the limited boat space and lack of North American foundries, the large bell metal and copper kettles favored for brewing were initially not available. Rather, iron cauldrons were all that the earliest colonial brewers had. Cast iron presents both thermal and chemical challenges as opposed to the copper and bronze vessels favored for the boiling steps of brewing. Instead of the barrels made of staves that were common in England at this time, 17th century colonial brewers often used wooden tubs carved out of large logs or stumps instead. These vessels absorbed moisture differently than barrels made of staves, and as solid objects breathed differently than the traditional pieced barrels did. They were also harder to clean effectively to prevent beer from rotting in frustrating ways, like going sour or ropey. The one problem the New World brewer did not have was fuel problems. Unlike in England, where wood fuel could be a limiting factor, there was plenty in the New World. But getting properly cured wood that would burn predictably so the malt didn't burn or the sugary wort didn't scorch could still be an issue. But all in all, even if it would be unrecognizable to the modern drinker, there was 17th century colonial beer. It was definitely cloudier and likely more sour and smoky, but less bitter than beers favored today. It would likely have less of an alcohol kick unless it was a special beer, though it might have an unexpected chemical bonus, mild euphoric or hallucinogenic effects specifically. But in most cases, it would be filling, refreshing, and get the job done. Though in a fair number of cases, when brewers were working out the intricacies of persimmons and pine straw, pumpkins and corn cobs, people were glad that most of the local New World water was actually quite good. As for the Native American populations, while history makes much of the troubling and ongoing legacy of the introduction of distilled spirits, it is largely silent on any low-alcohol brewed beverages. Because of the large-scale human and cultural destruction done by disease and often out of sight, it is frankly hard to know exactly what was going on in the American coastal communities. In the 17th century colonial landscape, the production and consumption of brewed beverages, both fermented and not, where they did happen, they were inward-facing community activities all over the Americas. Villages and farms were thoroughly taken over and erased, and what written records we have were kept by colonists and explorers looking to paint Native Americans as strange, primitive, and lacking in any civilized habits. So the brewing of beverages, fermented or not, even when they were encountered, they were downplayed or totally exoticized. There exist accounts of a, quote, black drink, which seems to have been a ceremonial drink, a purgative, a great strength tonic, or nothing in particular at all. Incidentally, there is some recent work that points to a drink like this being brewed from ilex species plants, which are related to holly, and they contain the same chemical stimulants as cacao. But at this point in American food history, whatever brewing traditions that were present among the pre-colonization coastal communities in the 17th century, they had no interaction with colonial practices. So what about the enslaved West Africans who were starting to make up larger and larger portions of the population in North America in the 17th century? They matter because they definitely had beer culture. In fact, beer was possibly an even more important social thread there than it was at Europe at the same time. Sorghum and millet beer were and remain important parts of the social structure of many West Africans. But wait, there's more. Remember back in episode 6 when I talked about how the Portuguese introduced corn into West Africa in the 16th century? Well, Michael Twitty, author of The Cooking Gene and the Rice Cookbook, pointed out to me that corn wasn't just sitting there. It was used for brewing as well. So in North America, you had people who had been stripped of so much, including even a common language. It's hard to imagine that some of the West African brewing traditions were not practiced in North America to create both a social tie and a taste of home. Later, sorghum syrup would become an Appalachian staple in the 18th and 19th century, so the growing and harvesting of sorghum definitely made it to American shores. Because sorghum, millet, and corn beers all shared manufacturing techniques, I feel it's reasonable to speculate that some of the corn rations issued to the early West Africans enslaved to clear land, herd cows, hoe tobacco, keep house, and run errands, some of that corn may also have been quietly used to brew beer. So this was the state of most of 17th century brewing. Very local, mostly in the home, and centered on make-do beers created out of corn, scraps of other grains, and whatever sugar sources were to be had. These oddball beers, based on 17th century English brewing traditions, created an essential energy and vitamin store in the colonies. But based on letters home and diary entries, they tended to be okay, or fine, or basically not poisonous. Then William Penn arrived with his vision of a Quaker utopia at the end of the century. And as I explained last week, he was followed by a flood of skilled farmers carrying their own different beer traditions. At the speed of ox carts and coastal shipping, the beer of Pennsylvania and its grain spread throughout the colonies. While we may have fun once a year with beers that contain a few pumpkin slices with a nice side of pleasant spices, nobody is clamoring to bring back parsnip, pumpkin pulp, and cornstalk beers, though the modernized persimmon beers appear to have some legs. No one was particularly sad to see the earliest beers of the colonial era go, and from what I've read, I'm not inclined to argue. They were happy to pick up the Pennsylvania barley and mixed grains and start again with English fashions and what became lumped together and known as German brewing traditions. Once breweries, both of the home type and the emerging town ordinary or tavern, were set up and stable, they became not just the source of a hearty breakfast drink. They were also dependable sources of yeast. The Pennsylvania grains didn't just spread beer culture, they also helped create American baking cultures. It starts in the risen yeast bread and baking traditions of England, but as with beer, it gets adapted. Next week, we'll look at what the 17th century colonial bread scene looked like, where and how bread was baked, and what it tended to be made of. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Any email questions or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. A few words to review this podcast really do make a difference and help me make sure I'm heading in an interesting direction. And I swear, beer being episode 21 was completely an accident. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio at DHOA Food and in the show description.